What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we dive into some comments and uncommons from Phyrexia All Be One that I feel like stand out to me. Some of them being cards that will help make certain decks around certain archetypes kind of work out. And I feel like these are some key cards, especially if you're a budget-friendly player, that could look at to possibly be options if you can't afford the rares and mythics. With that being said, let's just dive into the cards and let's just start talking about them. So the first card up on this list is going to be Annex Sentry. And this is a card that really stood out to me when I first read it, as it's a 3-mana 1/4 creature with Toxic 1 artifact creature that when it enters the battlefield, you get to exile target artifact or creature an opponent controls with mana value 3 or less until it leaves the battlefield. And I actually think this is like a really good card, not just because it is kind of like another Brutal Cathar. It being uncommon makes it very, playable, especially for players who are maybe a little more limited on currency and can't afford the rares and mythics. So if you don't have Brutal Cathars, you could probably play with this for the time being until maybe you get those rares and evolve into Brutal Cathars. But I think it's an overall very, very good card for being 3 mana, and what it does is definitely very effective, and definitely probably will see some play in not just artifact strategies, but also in decks that are looking for other ways to remove things from the battlefield. And the other thing, like I said, the upside to this is that it actually removes artifacts on the battlefield, so it can get rid of things like Bankbuster and things like that, which makes it definitely very effective as well. The next card up on this list is going to be Jawbone Duel. It's a 2-mana 1/1 double strike with Toxic 1. This card overall is pretty decent. Creatures with double strike are always very good to have. If you're someone who's looking to play Toxic and looking to play it in the white color, this is definitely a card that you're probably going to want to have in that 2-drop slot, just because I do think if it gets through any points of damage, it gives your opponent automatically 2 poison counters, which is definitely very key. And if you can buff it up power-wise, you can definitely get through some even bigger points of damage, which makes it definitely very playable in that 2-mana slot, especially for people who want to try poison out and try to win that way. The next card up on this is going to be Mandible Justicar. It's a 2-mana 2/1 lifelinker that whenever another artifact enters the battlefield under control, it gains +1/+1 to end a turn. And this is definitely kind of one of those unique things that I know it's not really like super overwhelmingly a positive, but I do think with Brothers War and other artifacts that we would get with this set, there are a lot of playable artifact decks that will definitely maybe see play. And I do think this is like, if you're maybe playing on a budget and you're looking to play artifacts, this is definitely not a bad card to have, because even if you play one artifact after it comes on the battlefield, it becomes a 3/2 lifelinker, which is already definitely much better than a 2/1 lifelinker for 2 mana. So definitely in the common slot, this definitely has some value, especially if you're a budget player and looking to try maybe some sort of budget artifact list, maybe like Boros artifacts or maybe even like Azorius artifacts. Both definitely playable, and this is definitely a good card to have, especially being a budget player. So the next card up on this list is going to be Ossification, a 2-mana enchantment aura that enchants a basic land we control, and when it enters the battlefield, we get to exile target creature or planeswalker until it leaves the battlefield. Now, it's not as good as like say like a card like Oblivion Ring, but it's definitely a very good card in the sense that it's really hard to get rid of that basic land, and the really only way that your opponent can really do anything to get rid of it would be to destroy the enchantment. So for 2 mana, I do think this is overall pretty powerful, especially if you're looking for some control options. If you're playing like Azorius Control, or you're looking to play the long game, this is definitely not a bad card to have, especially to interact with like early game threats your opponent may have. Moving on to blue, the first card we have up is Bring the End In. It's a 2-mana instant speed counter target spell unless its controller pays 2. So it's kind of like another Make Disappear, but the upside of this is if you're playing poison with this, is that you get the counter target spell instead if its controller has 3 or more poison counters. So it turns into a 2-mana counter target spell, so a 2-mana counter spell for 1 colorless and a blue, instead of like the typical counter spell which has double blue in its mana cost. And I do think this is definitely very good. So in the early game, your opponent's more than likely not going to have enough mana to pay for it, but if you're able to put enough poison on them throughout the game, by the time you get into the late game and you draw this, it becomes a very effective counter spell for only 2 mana. And I do think this is definitely one of those things with various ways to put poison on your opponent and also be able to proliferate, that you'll be able to definitely get this thing to that corrupted ability even if you don't kill your opponent by poison. This is definitely going to be a very good common to have in a control deck, or looking to play some control spells maybe in an aggro toxic deck. So the next card up on this list is going to be Distorted Curiosity, a 3-mana sorcery with corruption of the spell costs 2 less to cast if the opponent has 3 or more poison counters, and then you draw 2 cards at sorcery speed for 3 mana. But if you do get that corrupted ability, it becomes a 1-mana draw 2, which is definitely very, very good, especially if you're playing that long game, you're looking for additional card draw. Having that ability to possibly draw on 2 cards for 1 card is definitely very good, and with it being only 1 mana, makes this a very effective spell. And like I said, there's a lot of ways to get counters on your opponent toxic wise, and then from there you can proliferate and kind of go tick your opponent up poison-wise and just get them to that 3-point to make all your spells even more effective. So the next card up on this list is going to be Minor Misstep, a 1-mana counter target spell with mana value 1 or less, instant speed. Definitely a very good card. Probably won't see a ton of play in Standard, but this is one of those cards that we'll see play in other like Eternal formats, like a Modern, like a Historic, like a Pioneer, like a Explorer. This is definitely a very, very good card, as those formats typically have a lot more cheap creatures, and this is going to hit a lot more of those spells because they typically play a lot of cheap things. And it's definitely an overall very, very good card. If you get them physically, these are cards you probably want to hold on to as time goes on. These will probably go up in value as the set gets older, but it's still overall a very good 1-mana counter target spell. The next card up on this list is going to be Annihilating Glare. And right off the bat, if you're looking at this card and you're reading it, it looks exactly like Eaten Alive. The big difference is that instead of exiling the creatures, it's destroying the creature or planeswalker that it's targeting. And the other big difference here is that on top of being able to sacrifice a creature, you can also sacrifice an artifact to pay that additional cost. And with us being in a format where there's a lot of ways to produce like artifacts for like tokens, like blood tokens or treasure tokens, this card's actually pretty decent for being a common. I don't know if it's better than, say, Eaten Alive, but I do think the ability that you can produce artifacts and or creatures, which helps out, especially for 1 mana, makes this card pretty effective, especially in the early game. I know it's sorcery speed, you can't target something immediately, but it's one of those things that during your turn, if you have a blood token, if you're, say, like playing like Rakdos Anvil or something like that, this is definitely a card that could see some play in that deck, because not only are you producing artifact creatures, you're also having other ways to generate artifacts onto the battlefield. This is definitely a good card to have, especially being a common. The next card on this list is going to be Anoint with Affliction, a 2-mana instant speed spell that exiles target creature if it has mana value 3 or less. If you get them to get the Corrupted ability triggered, it actually exiles that creature regardless of mana cost, making this actually a pretty effective common spell for removal. Definitely something to mess around with in Standard. It's definitely a great limited card, as it's a card that can definitely hit a lot of things, especially in draft. And I do think if you can get a decent toxic deck around that puts decent amount of poison counters, this definitely could be a pretty effective removal spell, as well as it, like I said, it exiles target creature. It doesn't actually destroy it, so your opponent has to give that creature hexproof really for that creature to be prevented from leaving the battlefield. But still, overall, pretty decent common to have that has some sort of removal spell at a cheap cost. The next card up on this list is going to be Billow Skull Dweller. It's a 1-mana 1/1 Phyrexian insect creature with Death Touch and Toxic 1. This is overall pretty solid option in mono black if you're looking to play Toxic and get poison counters on your opponent. A 1-mana 1/1 and with Death Touch actually makes it a little tricky for your opponent to block with. That if they don't have any sort of way to get that creature indestructible, this is going to trade with a lot of things on the battlefield, making it an overall pretty decent card to get those initial points of Toxic in onto your opponent. And I do think this is definitely not a bad little 1-drop if you're looking to play some sort of Toxic deck that has black in it. The next card up on this list is going to be Drown in the Ichor, a 2-mana sorcery speed spell that gives target creature -4 to end a turn, and then you proliferate. And this is actually a pretty decent removal spell. I know it's sorcery speed, so it's not as good as some of the other removal spells that exist currently in the format, but I do think -4/-4 or minus anything kind of removal is always very good to have. I think the upside here is that you also could proliferate for only 2 mana, so it's removal and proliferation. So if you have toxic counters, poison counters, even loyalty counters or +1/+1 counters, this is gonna trigger you to tick up in that way. And I do think it's a pretty effective spell. This is probably something you'll probably have a couple copies of in your deck if you're looking to play some sort of counter deck, just because it's pretty effective at what it does, and it could be a decent removal spell as well as triggering some other things in your deck. Overall, pretty cool card to mess around with. Probably a couple copies of at least, but overall, pretty decent card. And the next card we have is Scheming Aspirant, a 2-mana 1/3 that whenever we proliferate, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. And I think this is an overall pretty strong card. It's definitely tough to get rid of having 3 toughness. It's not going to die to like a Play with Fire or something like that. And there are a lot of ways to trigger proliferation and then trigger this ability, making this overall pretty decent. Combine that with being able to give your opponent poison counters. This is one of those things that you'll be able to drain them as well as also tick up on their poison. And overall, pretty decent card, I would say, for only being a 2-mana uncommon. Definitely something that if you're going to be playing proliferation or any game that you're going to try to tick up counters, you probably want to have a couple copies of these. Just because you're going to want these on the battlefield to slowly drain your opponent as well. Next card up is going to be Sheoldred's Edict. It's a 2-mana instant speed spell that makes your opponent sacrifice either a non-token creature, makes your opponent sacrifice a creature token, or your opponent sacrifices a planeswalker. And I do think this is definitely another effective kind of removal spell. It's, yet again, not as good as the other removal spells that directly destroy or exile target creature, but this is definitely something to kind of consider, as this definitely hits planeswalkers on top of that instant speed. So for 2 mana, you maybe make them sacrifice that 1 planeswalker they have. Definitely not too bad. Overall, pretty okay-ish card, but like I said, it doesn't probably overpower some of the other 2-drop removal spells, but definitely a card to mess around with and kind of see how effective it does in the meta as it develops post Phyrexia launch. So the next card up on this list is going to be Blazing Crescendo. It is a 2-mana instant speed spell that gives target creature +3/+1 to end a turn, and then you get to exile the top part of your library until end of your next turn, and you may play that card. So this is kind of like a Reckless Impulse combined with a creature pump spell for only 2 mana, and it's being pretty decent for a common. If you play any sort of Swiss Spear deck, this is definitely one of those cards that puts pressure on your opponent's life total, pumping the Swiss Spear on top of that, giving it also additional pumps with the prowess. And then you get to exile the card and either find land or find maybe another card to follow up on the next turn. Definitely overall decent card for only 2 mana. Not sure if it's a 4 of in those style of decks, but definitely not a bad card to consider if you're looking for a way to push damage as well as also get a little bit of card advantage in one way or the other. The next card up is going to be Cacophony Scamp, a 1-mana 1/1 goblin that whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may sacrifice it. If you do proliferate, whenever it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. It's kind of like a unique card that I do think can see a ton of play, especially in decks that play +1/+1 counters, oil counters, whatever kind of counters, as it is one of those things that your opponent's not going to really want to block it unless they have a really big creature that it can't trade with that creature. But overall, it's a pretty effective spell. If you can put additional power on it, it's going to become even better because then it does more damage when it leaves the battlefield or when it dies when it leaves the battlefield. So it's one of those cards that for 1 mana, it's overall pretty effective, especially in counter-style decks. Next card up, we have is Churning Reservoir, a 1-mana artifact that, being over upkeep, we get to put a counter on another target non-token artifact creature we control. For 2 mana, we can create a 1/1 red Phyrexian Goblin creature token, activate only if a token was removed from a permanent we control or a permanent with an oil counter on it was put into the graveyard this turn. This is definitely another interesting card, as this is a card that's kind of like one of those oil generators for only being 1 mana. It's definitely going to be kind of interesting to see if oil counters become a thing, but it being able to create tokens in general is definitely be a pretty decent thing, especially if you're able to get those abilities to trigger it for only 2 mana. Overall, pretty decent kind of 1 mana card. And like I said, it's going to be a matter of whether or not token decks that contain oil or cards that do oil things will make this card super effective for only being 1 mana. After that, following on with the oil thing, we have Exuberant Fusiling, a 1 mana 0/1 Trampler Goblin Warrior that gets +1/+0 for each oil counter on it. When it enters the battlefield or whenever another creature or artifact you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, you may put an oil counter on Exuberant Fusiling. Kind of going along with the oil things with proliferation, this is going to be another one of those cards that your opponent's going to want to have to deal with very, very quickly before it starts getting bigger and out of hand, as it does have trample. So if you're able to have tons of things with oil counters on it, it's going to become onto the battlefield as a really big creature that they're going to have to deal with immediately. It's definitely going to be kind of interesting because it being only 0 toughness, it's going to be very easy for your opponent maybe to pick it off, but definitely one of those cards to maybe look out for, especially if you're looking to play oil. Not too bad to include for only being 1 mana. Following that up, we have Furnace Punisher, a 3 mana 3/3 menace. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, it deals 2 damage to that player unless they control 2 or more basics. This is going to be another interesting card in the meta, just because there are a lot of non-basics and a lot of decks that contain mostly non-basics and barely any basic lands. This is going to be a card that could put pressure on your opponent's life total. It being uncommon and being a 3/3 with menace, and on top of that having that ability, it makes it an overall pretty decent card if you expect to be playing against a lot of decks that contain a lot of lands that aren't basic. It kind of makes your opponent have to make sure they put a few basics in it, at least hit in that 2 mark, but it's overall pretty effective. Even if it's not a main staple card, it's definitely a good card to have in sideboards, especially if you feel like if you're playing any sort of red and you're playing against an opponent that may not play tons of basics. This is definitely one of those cards you side in after game 1, but overall pretty solid card for being 3 mana. Next card up is going to be Sawblade Scamp, a 1 mana 1/1 creature with haste that whenever we cast a non-creature spell, we may put an oil counter on Sawblade Scamp. You can tap it, remove an oil counter from it, and deal 1 damage to each opponent. This is going to be one of those cards that actually I think if you're trying to play a burn strategy is going to be very, very effective, as I do think this is going to be a good way to kind of put pressure on your opponent's life total without actually having to cast a spell. You combine this with, say, a card like Mechanized Warfare. It turns that 1 damage into 2 damage, and if depending on how many you have, it'll be even more additional damage. Overall, making this a pretty effective way to kind of just put pressure on your opponent's life total through burn without actually having to cast burn spells, making it pretty solid for being a common 1-drop. Moving on to green, the first card up we have is going to be a 2 mana 0/3 that gets +3/+0 as long as it has 3 or more oil counters on it. Tap it for 1 mana whenever it becomes tapped. Exile target card from a graveyard and put an oil counter Armored Scapegoater. This is actually a pretty good card, I think, overall, right? It's a mana producer, and then on top of that, it can eat graveyards, and then if you eat 3 things out of the graveyard, it's going to become a 3/3 for only 2 mana. So it's definitely kind of got a lot of things going for it. I'm not sure if it's going to be super effective, but it's definitely a card for being uncommon. Definitely has a lot of upside to it, and definitely can help you out ramp up in the early game. Overall, making it pretty effective one way or the other, whether it's attacking or whether it's tapping for mana. It's definitely going to be able to eat things from the graveyard and still be a mana ramper after the fact, even if it becomes a 3/3. Going on to the Evolve and Adaptive, a 1 mana 0/0 that enters the battlefield with an oil counter on it. It gets +1/+1 for each oil counter on it, and whenever another creature enters the battlefield under control, if it has greater power and toughness than Evolve and Adaptive, put an oil counter on Evolve and Adaptive. So another solid 1-drop I think green needs. A lot of green creatures are relatively on the large side, and you being able to drop this on turn 1, follow that up with even a 2/2 on turn 2. Then follow that up with anything that could possibly be played in green on on turn 3. Makes this card actually pretty effective. I know it can't attack immediately when it comes out, but it's one of those cards that grows over the course of the game and itself becomes like a 4/4 or something like that, and becomes a thing your opponent has to deal with. Also, if you're able to proliferate or add additional oil counters, this card becomes bigger as well, which is also pretty awesome. It's pretty effective for being a 1-drop uncommon. Definitely something to keep an eye out if you're looking to play some sort of green deck with oil counters, or maybe like Gruul oil counters or something like that. Something I could see being playable. Definitely this is going to be one of those cards you're going to want to have in that deck. Next card up we have is Expand the Sphere. It's a 4-mana sorcery spell. We get to look at the top 6 cards of our library. We can put up to 2 land cards from among them onto the battlefield tapped, and the rest on the bottom of our library in a random order. If we were to put fewer than 2 lands out onto the battlefield, we proliferate equal to the difference. So if we put 1 land out, we proliferate once. If we put 0 lands out, we proliferate twice, making it pretty effective, whether or not depending on the game situation. So if you're looking to proliferate additional counters onto things you control, you don't put any lands out and proliferate for 4 mana, proliferate twice for 4 mana. If you want to ramp up for 4 mana, you can then put 2 lands out immediately if you're able to hit them in the top 6. Overall, making it a pretty interesting card to mess around with. It's probably not something you're going to play 4 copies of, but it's something you could probably play like 2 copies of in a deck that you're trying to be aggressive with mana, as well as being able to be aggressive with counters, making this overall pretty decent for 4 mana. Here we have Thirsting Roots, a 1-mana sorcery speed spell that overall is a pretty solid spell. For 1 mana, you can search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, or you proliferate. So it has 2 upsides here. It's kind of like a dig up, but doesn't have the additional ability of the cleave ability of dig up in the first ability. And then 1 mana proliferate in case you're looking to just put additional counters on things. Though the downside is you can't do it as a combat trick and do that instant speed. It's a sorcery speed spell, but still not bad for being a common and only being 1 mana. Next card up is going to be Tyvar Stand. It's an X green instant speed spell that gives target creature we control +X/+X end of turn, hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. All of it very good. You can do this for just 1 green mana and give your creature just hexproof and indestructible. Or if you have open mana and your opponent tries to target your creature, you can invest more mana into it and then give that creature +X/+X based on whatever that is. Overall, pretty decent. I do think the flexibility of being able to sink mana into it outside of just being a 1-mana indestructible hexproof card makes this card pretty effective, especially as a decent combat trick in some sort of way. If you feel like your opponent doesn't really have anything, this is a good way to finish off your opponent. This is also a good thing to also protect your creature depending on what your opponent's trying to do. Moving into multicolor, first card we have is Cephalad Sentry. It's a 4-mana flying artifact creature that has power equal to the number of artifacts we control. This is kind of be one of those unique things. I don't know if Azorius artifacts will be a great kind of style deck, but this is definitely one of those things that if you're looking for some sort of top end in maybe an artifact style deck in these colors, this is definitely not a bad card to kind of keep an eye out for. With it being having 5 toughness and also having flying, makes it actually pretty effective. Even if you only have like 4 artifacts out, it's a 4-mana 4/5, even more depending on if you have artifact tokens, things like that. This thing can go up pretty quickly, overall making it a pretty decent 4-drop to have, especially if you're a budget player. Next card up is going to be Slaughter Singer. It's a 2-mana 2/2 with toxic 2 creature, and whenever another creature we control with toxic attacks, it gets +1/+1 to end of turn. This is definitely not a bad card to have, as I believe green and white have a lot of ways to produce maybe those might tokens that have toxic on them that are 1/1s. These are definitely not too bad, and having this out combined with those is definitely going to be effective in getting in those additional points of damage to your opponent's life total, not only to their toxic poison total. Overall, pretty solid card to have if you're looking to play some sort of green-white poison style deck. And the final card on the list is going to be Voidwing Hybrid. It's a 2-mana 2/1 flyer, the toxic 1, that whenever we proliferate, we get to return it from our graveyard to our hand. So this is one of those cards that has a good way to kind of get itself back from the graveyard, as blue and black, I think, from Phyrexia have a lot of ways to proliferate. So this has a lot of decent ways to kind of get back onto the battlefield. Also, this is kind of like that key card I would say that blue-black needs, especially if you're looking to play corrupted spells in blue-black, to kind of get those initial points of poison onto your opponent. And then unlocking your corrupted abilities. So this is overall a pretty effective spell. Definitely a card that I am going to check out. I'll probably throw together some sort of Dimir proliferate style deck, and this will definitely be a key card in that deck. But with that being said, I mean, this is kind of like some of the cards I'm looking forward to messing around with in some of the decks that are themed around some of the mechanics from the set. Let me know if there's a card out of this list that you think is definitely catching your eye. Is there something I missed that you think that you also think will be pretty cool to play with, maybe in the common and uncommon slot? I'm just overall excited to start diving into Phyrexia and kind of messing around and kind of seeing what what it provides to the meta. With that being said, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, you want to post new videos on the channel like this one, hit that subscribe button. But until next time, I'll see you in the next video. If you're liking the content on the channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It definitely helps out a lot. Also, if you want to go the extra mile, you can simply click the join button. You can join the channel and become a member for as little as $1. That will also help support the channel.